Hello and welcome to this long-term reading project in which we discuss a section of Thomas Mann's novel The Magic Mountain every week. My name is David, and if this is the first video you're watching on this channel, I recommend watching my introductory video first, in which I describe why it is worth reading this novel, which is more than 100 years old, and also how this project is going to be organized. And of course, you may also want to watch the videos in which I discuss the first chapters of this novel. In short, in these weekly videos, I will not give a summary of the respective section, but I will rather assume that you have already read it. And what I would like to do is share my observations and thoughts with you that have come to me while reading or the novel or while doing some research, but also questions and problems that I have while reading and that you may be able to help me with. In the section that we read last week, that is the 5th to the 8th section of chapter 4, from the Hippe section to the table talk section, decisive inner and outer transformation takes place in Hans Castorp. Thomas Mann underlines the great significance of these episodes by setting this part of the plot on the 7th day of Hans' stay at the Berghof. So once again, this highly symbolic number of 7 suggests, I think, a special significance. So what happens here? I think that in these sections, Hans Castorp goes through 7 mental or emotional stages or processes, and I've tried to list them, and sorry, I couldn't resist the temptation to use the number 7 here myself. So I found the following 7 mental or emotional stages. First of all, it's recollection of what happened in the past with Pribislav Hippe. Second, the realization that Pribislav and Clawdia, there's a connection between the two. It's third, it's a first reaction of annoyance that Clawdia comes so close to him, that she's always in his presence. Fourth, the interesting state of shame and embarrassment of himself, but also of what Clawdia is doing. The 5th stage is a sort of a fascination by Clawdia, followed by the opposite, by sort of denial. He does not want to confess that he's sort of infatuated, and 7th, then there is this stage of infatuation where it becomes clear that he is in love with her. And my theory or thesis is that this mental transformation of Hans, which takes place in this chapter, is the pivotal point for his staying at the Berghof for a long time, and that this mental change, his falling in love with Clawdia Shosha, is really the actual reason for his prolonged stay. Also, apart from these 7 internal mental or emotional processes, also on the external material level, there are, I think, at least 2 different processes, additional processes that take place in parallel, which provide the external reason, or rather the justification, also usable as a justification towards others for Hans to stay at the Berghof. First, it is his evidently impaired health status, or his slowly emerging illness. And according to Dr. Krokowski's thesis, this is only a consequence of his state of infatuation. And this fits in perfectly with Krokowski's theory according to the title of his lecture series. So, Love as a Disease-Forming Power, or as he says elsewhere, all illness is transformed love, which according to Krokowski applies particularly to those forms of love that do not lead to the prescribed love life, and that love life that is in accordance with the regulations. And according with the regulations, that in that case means that it's a love that must serve the procreation of the human race. And I think that this is also Hans Castorp's own opinion, of which he even tries to convince himself in a sort of an inner conversation with himself, with a apathy, of course, added after the statement. And as this is not possible with a woman as sick as Clawdia Shosha, Hans believes that his love for her is basically wrong. as wrong as was his love for Pribislav, because it cannot lead to the natural result of procreation of the human race. And in his, or in Krokowski's logic, which he has obviously internalized, this can only lead to illness. And I'll come back to Dr. Krokowski and the scientific validity of his thesis later. But now let's stay with Hans again. I think the second external development or factor, which certainly at least favors his subsequent long stay at the Berghof, is quite banal. He gets the bill for his first week at the Berghof, and he realizes that despite all that is offered there, the bill is quite moderate, 180 francs for a week. And let me remind you of the information from the previous video. The average monthly household income back then was about 600 francs. So 180 francs is 30% of that for a week. So that's not exactly a bargain. But for a well-off single man who has an income well above the average, alone from his assets and interests alone, this is also something he can afford in the long term, or probably even permanently without any financial worries. So let's summarize. In this section, what we see is that the internal and the external conditions are created for Hans to get trapped at the Berghof, to stay at the Berghof for a long time. And we also see this change reflected in his entire behavior. At the beginning of the section with the title Hippe, Hans still stands there demonstratively like an outsider, like a third party not involved, a flaneur, a person not directly involved, a guest. So he stands there with a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, his hands deep in his pockets. He's just watching the Russian ladies' merry departure for their joyride. But at the end of the section, at the end of the table talk section, he lies in his deck chair humming sentimental love songs, and he gets palpitations by just thinking about Clawdia Socha. So now he's completely involved and hooked. But let's go through the 7 points or 7 phases of Hans' mental and emotional change one by one. State 1 and 2 I would classify as recollection and realization. So recollection of this scene with Pribislav, and realization that Pribislav and Clawdia, they are strongly related to each other. So in order to experience these 2 decisive steps of recollection or remembrance and realization, Hans has to leave the Berghof. And I think this is a very old motif in world literature, that the hero has to set off on a pilgrimage or on a quest, a journey of discovery or adventure, or in order to solve a riddle, to find himself, to have a decisive insight about oneself or the world. And here it is the mountain world that Hans has to enter. And in this section, I think the title of the novel really becomes coherent for the first time. Out in nature, up on the mountain, the magic mountain. This is where the hero's decisive transformation takes place. This is where the time magic takes place. And this is also a place where, on top of that, some physical change begins on 3 physical levels. He becomes short of breath, he has a severe nosebleed, and his head trembles. So he really becomes of a very weak physical state. And the mental transformation sets in. He falls into a trance-like state in which he has the decisive dream, this memory of his homoerotic crush on his classmate Pribislav Hippe, and he realizes that his whole interest in Clawdia Socha is essentially based on the fact that her Slavic facial features remind him strongly of Pribislav. And I think the homoerotic nature of his crush on Pribislav is made unmistakable by the symbolism of the pencil scene. I quote from the text, "A silver pencil holder with a ring in the end, which one screwed in order to make the red lead pencil come out." I don't think that you need a diploma in psychoanalysis to get the meaning of all the phallic symbolism here. Hence, I am going to deliberately set a counterpoint here by not going into the details of this psychoanalytical symbolism, but by addressing the material aspect. I did a bit of research and I found something that I think must have or might have been the model for the silver pencil holder mentioned in the text. This beautiful antique piece here, and the video and the photos are, by the way, shown by courtesy of the Australian antique shop Barrington and Son. So this model was manufactured by Samson, Morden and Co. in London in 1895. And I think it fits perfectly the description of the mechanism. And also the year of manufacture makes sense, because the episode that Hans remembers must have taken place around 1897 or 98. So when the model had been on the market for about 2 or 3 years. And a second aspect that struck me when I read this part is I stumbled a bit with the detailed description of the mountain panorama in which Hans Kastrup sits down on a bench. And I mean, the text of about half a page, which begins with, "On issuing from the wood, he paused, struck by the charm of the small enclosed landscape before him, a scene composed of elements both peaceful and sublime." And then the landscape is described in great detail, in which Hans' recollection and realization ultimately take place. And this scene reminded me strongly of the story Rip Van Winkle by the American writer Washington Irving. For those of you who don't know the story of Rip Van Winkle in a nutshell, in the colony of New York in the late 18th century, I think, the Dutch settler Rip Van Winkle takes his dog on a trip into the mountains, into the Catskill Mountains. He has some strange encounter with very strange old man, but then he gets tired and he lies down and he falls asleep. And when he wakes up again and returns to his hometown, it turns out that 20 years have passed. So he himself is considered long lost. But in the end, an ancient woman recognizes him, and his children have long since grown up, and New York is no longer a British colony, but independent, and so on. But for me, there are parallels between Rip Van Winkle's story and this scene of Hans in the mountains. The parallels are really striking. On the one hand, there are really great similarities in the description of the landscape, in the landscape itself, in which this time magic takes place. And both heroes experience just such a time magic or suspension or displacement of time. In Rip Van Winkle's case, it is a simple beaming forward into the future. And with Hans Kastrup, it is somewhat more complex. Here again, we see Thomas Mann's typical concept of working with movement and counter-movement, with point and counterpoint. And on the mental level, Hans is transported back into the past. He is rejuvenated. He is transported back into his school days. But on the outer physical level, he gets a foretaste of the future. So as an old man, he wobbles his head like an old man, quite literally like his own grandfather. And physically, he is as limp as a doddering old man. And I find it interesting that this mental regression to schoolboy age is still evident, is still visible in his behavior and in his movements later on in this section. The description how he sneaks into the dining room late to listen to the lecture of Dr. Krokowski. This shows all the characteristics of an embarrassed schoolboy who is a little ashamed of being late and now acts as if nothing has happened. So I quote from the text, he squeezed himself with much precaution, tongue between his teeth, through the partly open glass door into the dining room. Or he assumed an air of having been there from the beginning. I think this is classic schoolboy behavior. There are two small observations on this dream scene about Pribislav Hippe. I think it's worth reading this text carefully to see in how many places there are linguistic references to the fact that normally valid boundaries are abolished here. And this takes on for quite some time. And then how everything very suddenly returns to normality. So the boundary between past and present, between people, is blurred. And then the picture all of a sudden returns to the normal course of time, back to normal mode, when Hans says, "Oh, I must be steering, and pretty fast too." So this pretty fast too, it makes it clear, not only does he become aware of the actual current time, but the pretty fast even hints at a kind of trying to catch up with the time that had passed or been missed during his trance moment. And the boundaries between people also become blurred in this section. And it's not just about Pribislav and Clawdia. This is already prepared by the narrator or indicated by the two men that Hans encounters, the two native ones, who almost blur into one person. Both are bearded, both have an axe, both are moving almost in sync or as mirror images. They're smiling at each other, turning their shoulders towards each other. And of course, suddenly one is the things changes and one is breaking off and moving downhill. And of course, also the difference between Pribislav and Clawdia is suspended at the heart of this section. And this is also foreshadowed in Hans' dream in the third chapter already, where he experiences the very same pencil scene, but with Clawdia instead of Pribislav. And in Hans' soliloquy, after he has come to realize the connection between Clawdia and Pribislav, it occurs to him that maybe there is no difference in person between the two. I quote from the text, "Is that why I feel interested in her? Or," and this is more interesting, "was that why I felt so interested in him?" And so the latter part is particularly interesting, because here, therefore, he considered it possible that back then in his school days, he was already looking for Clawdia in Pribislav, via Pribislav at that time. So he seems to think, or at least for a moment to speculate, about a reality or a dimension in which neither time nor the difference between the two characters matter. And I would just like to briefly touch on something here that I can't go into further in the video due to time constraints. We see here that Hans thinks that he was already looking for Clawdia in Pribislav at the time back in the school. And this is an indication that Thomas Mann was not only interested in Freudian psychoanalysis, but was also fascinated by the ideas of Carl Gustav Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, who has some similarities, but also many differences with Freud's theories. And if you are interested in this, I can only invite you to take a closer look at Carl Gustav Jung and his theories, and in particular his theories on the collective unconscious and on the archetypes. And then with this new knowledge to read again this section from that perspective. Let's move on to the third mental or emotional state that Hans goes through, the state of annoyance. And I find this very interesting. You might think that after his realization that Clawdia reminds him of Hippe, whom he used to admire so much, Hans should now immediately fall in love with Clawdia. But that's not the case. What we have here is, I would call it, a retarding element. So the pace is slowed down to increase the tension, or there's even a backward movement emotionally. First of all, Hans is annoyed. He's really annoyed by Clawdia, and that's not at all hidden between the lines, but it's stated quite openly. It really annoys him that she is sitting right in front of him right now. I quote from the text: "With a sense of exasperation, he recognized Madame Chauchat. Deuce take it, was he never to have a moment's peace? He had thought that, having arrived at his goal, he could sit here quietly and rest a little, and now he had to have her under his nose." And it doesn't stop here. His annoyance also gives him unearthly eyes for her weaknesses. He finds her gaze bold and ruthless. He immediately remembers her bad door slamming manners and notices her drooping shoulders and her flabby, flaccid back. How badly she held herself. Except for her eyes, so very difficult from the model pupil Pribislav, full of honors. And the annoyance slowly subsides during Krokowski's lecture, to which Hans does not listen continuously, because he's repeatedly distracted by his gaze on the other listeners and by his daydreams. And so he first sees Clawdia's hand, this unkempt schoolgirl's hand, but then the attractive arm, which appears even more attractive and seductive through the translucent fabric. Though there's a first brief flash of erotic attraction, but then immediately inhibited again intellectually, because in Krokowskian terms it is an improper or a perverted love, and also emotionally inhibited because this impropriety of his love or possible love for Clawdia also reminds him of his improper feelings for Pribislav, also an embarrassing memory for him. So Hans will therefore remain in this intermediate state for a while, on the one hand still annoyed by Clawdia, but on the other hand already irresistibly attracted. And I think Thomas Mann describes this very nicely in an interesting additional intermediate stage, which is the state of shaming and feeling embarrassed or ashamed on behalf of others. So I think this is explicitly described in the second part, in the second page of the section Table Talks, that he is ashamed in front of people. On the one hand, for his own unclear emotional state, for the emotional attachment he has to Mrs. Chauchat, but it also states that he is also ashamed for her, on behalf of her, and feeling ashamed on behalf of another person, or feeling embarrassed on behalf of someone else. I think this is a particularly interesting intermediate mental state. On the one hand, it's an expression of, so there somebody is doing something that we consider wrong or inappropriate, so we are sort of distancing us from that. But on the other hand, we are already so much emotionally connected to this person that we are not indifferent when this person embarrasses themselves, but we also feel ashamed or embarrassed on their behalf. In German, there's a nice verb, fremdschämen, which I think we can't translate into English perfectly, but it's really an expression, a one-verb expression of feeling shame on behalf of others, or feeling embarrassed on behalf of others. It nicely expresses this state where we have a connection, but not a full one. And then Hans moves on to stage 5 and 6, which is fascination, followed by a counterbalance, or counterbalanced by, followed by denial. So slowly but surely, Hans' emotional involvement with Clawdia continues, and I deliberately say involvement and not development. So he is interested in Clawdia. He wants to know her first name, her marital status, but also in practical terms, what does she think of her husband? How is she really connected to him? So ultimately, it's all, frankly speaking, it's all about whether there is a chance of a flirtation or a love affair with Clawdia for him. But all this is done very secretly, not openly, but in a clever, consensual game of deception with the teacher, Fräulein Engelhardt. And you've read the passage, so there's no need to go into the detail. But I think it becomes very clear that also Fräulein Engelhardt longs for male attention. And she has found out that she cannot get it directly, but she can get it indirectly from Hans by pretending to be infatuated with Clawdia, so by being linked to Clawdia, for which she then allows herself to be teased by Hans, and so she she gets the attraction that she needs, and by the other hand, she allows Hans to instrumentalize her in order to obtain information about Clawdia and to have a chance of talking about Clawdia without revealing his true feelings. So this is a very clever psychological game, and I quote from the text, each was perfectly aware that they lied and double lied. The German original even states they triple lied. And for Hans, this game has the advantage that he can live out his fascination and deny it at the same time by playing by just playing the sober and even critical observer on the outside who judges objectively the appearance of this sloppy young woman, at least with a sort of a fake objectivity. But we see that in the end, all denial is useless. In the end, we can see that Hans has actually reached stage 7, being in love, being infatuated. So he catches himself humming sentimental love songs, and he gets palpitations when he only thinks of Clawdia while lying in bed. So that was quite a long explanation of Hans. Let's take a look at what other topics and people we have worth discussing in this section. Let's move on to Pribislav and Clawdia for a little while. I have a few more words about them, and I think we have to treat the two together as they also belong together in Hans' perception. They merge into one another, so the boundaries between them become very blurred. And it is precisely this indeterminacy, so this blurring, the formlessness. So these are attributes that are repeatedly appear in connection with the two in the text. There is, for example, her veiled voice, and Pribislav's voice is also pleasantly veiled. It has a husky quality. And I'm not sure whether the English translation is really able to deliver the erotic qualities of the voice as it is described here in the German original. Being veiled is also characteristic of Pribislav's eyes. They're gray-blue or blue-gray, somewhat indefinite, which, I quote, could sometimes melt into a mystery of darkness, musing sideways. And also the farewell of Pribislav, who, I quote, dissolved into the mist. So it's also sort of veiled. But being veiled thus also seems to be a kind of a recurring attribute, which incidentally also has erotic connotation. At least Hans' thoughts also go in this direction when he sees Clawdia's arm in the translucent fabric. So this veiling makes it seem much more erotic than if the arm were unclothed and naked. Okay, let's move on to another character, to Dr. Krokowski and his psychoanalysis. And I think finally we need to talk a little bit about him and this psychoanalysis. I don't want to go into detail into his remarks of his lecture, because, as I said in the beginning, everything you need to know is actually encapsulated in the title of his lecture series, so Love as a Disease-Creating Power. And in his concluding sentence at the end of his lecture, so he says that symptoms of disease are nothing but a disguised manifestation of the power of love, and all disease is only love transformed. So Krokowski basically refers here to findings that are already common knowledge today, but they were actually new and almost unheard of at the time. So Sigmund Freud's observations and theories about the enormous psychological forces associated with the sex drive and the effects that psychological processes and especially inhibition or disorders in sexuality can have I can have on the body. The key points of Krokowski's explanation go back to a 1905 publication by Sigmund Freud entitled Three Treatises on Sexual Theory. So in 1907, when Hans was at the Berghof, the publication was just 2 years ago, so which is really relatively new. And in these treatises, Freud elaborates on the processes of repression, so which can lead to neurosis or psychosomatic symptoms, or on the process of sublimation, that is the creative redirection of sexual energy into artistic creation, for example. And in principle, much of this may be still valid today. I don't know. I'm not an expert in psychoanalysis. I think we should know that Thomas Mann had a fundamentally positive attitude towards psychoanalysis, or at least he was highly interested in it. He thought that it had some explanatory power, and today's knowledge of Thomas Mann's homosexuality also makes it easier to understand why he was so particularly interested in the approaches of psychoanalysis that explain artistic creation from repressed sexuality. But before I say something about the dubious light in which Thomas Mann casts Dr. Krokowski in the analysis section, I would first like to quote a few sentences, some of them abridged, from an essay by Thomas Mann himself about psychoanalysis. It's an essay entitled "My Relationship to Psychoanalysis." I quote, "My relationship to psychoanalysis is as complicated as it deserves to be. One has every right to see something great and admirable in psychoanalysis. On the other hand, though, one can find that, if misused, it can become an instrument of malignity and an anti-cultural mania of exposure and discrediting. Its essence is melancholy insight. That was nothing new to me, and it had become, as irony, an element of my mental constitution and my production." So, in other words, Thomas Mann appreciates psychoanalysis. He sees the explanatory power, but he also states that if it is applied in a wrong, oversimplified way and with the wrong motives, it can become harmful. And secondly, also in anticipation of a later video on this topic, I would like to point out the connection between melancholy and irony that Thomas Mann makes here. I think I already mentioned it at some point in an earlier video that according to the German philosopher Schopenhauer, one of Thomas Mann's favorite philosophers, a melancholy attitude can result from knowledge about the world and about us human beings, and that this kind of melancholy is also one of the fundamental themes of the Magic Mountain. And Thomas Mann also points out here that irony is a specific artistic means of expressing this very melancholic attitude. So irony, that is the saying of the exact opposite of what one means. And I think here we find a clue as to why Thomas Mann repeatedly plays this game of opposites, of counterbalances, of counterpoints in the novel. For him, this is just an artistic means for expression of an ironic attitude, ironic in the form as an artistic form of expression for this basic mood of melancholy that he experiences. Okay, that was a slight digression on Thomas Mann and psychoanalysis and irony and melancholy, all important topics for the novel, but back to Dr. Krokowski. So if Thomas Mann had this basically positive attitude about psychoanalysis, why on earth is Krokowski described here as such a shady, dubious character? And this essay that I mentioned earlier also tells us something about that, because it concludes with the following statement, the following final sentence about psychoanalysis. It, means psychoanalysis, also plays a role in my recently published novel, The Magic Mountain. Dr. Krokowski, as her agent is called here, is a bit quirky, but his quirkiness is perhaps only an indemnity for the deeper concessions that the author makes to psychoanalysis in his works. To put it in more simpler words, Thomas Mann acknowledges that psychoanalysis is right about many things, and he uses its explanatory patterns in his novels. And for him, this use of psychoanalysis for him is sort of a concession. Or perhaps we should read also Confession. Confession by Thomas Mann that provide an insight into his own repressed sexuality as the basis of his artistic powers. And so then it's a sort of concession that he makes, and then in turn he takes a little revenge for that by casting one of the representatives of psychoanalysis in a somewhat quirky or shady manner. So I think this digression told us now quite a lot about Thomas Mann, but what about Dr. Krokowski himself? What do we learn about his character in the novel, and by what narrative means? Let's start with the scientific substance and the moral integrity of Dr. Krokowski's lecture. The fact that Dr. Krokowski comes across here as sort of a false prophet with a hidden agenda of his own, or as a Pied Piper, as it is called at the end of the section, this is essentially due to the fact that he makes inadmissibly simplified and generalized statements. And he also deliberately makes fundamental logical errors in the process. I think he really commits these logical errors deliberately because they serve his purposes. One of the basic statements of psychoanalysis, according to Freud, was that repressed sexuality can lead to neurosis and other illnesses that today I think we call psychosomatic in their nature. And Dr. Krokowski now, he oversimplifies this to a universally valid statement, and he reverses the logic of a conclusion. So to speak, not some illnesses are caused by repressed or disturbed sexuality, but all illness is created by repressed or disturbed sexuality. And you can turn it around. So if you are ill, there's definitely something wrong with your sexuality. So I think this is a classic and a very easy to recognize logical error, but he does it out of self-interest because he has the panacea, which is soul dissection or psychoanalysis, which he is promoting here. And whether this is out of financial interest or because he just enjoys or needs having this kind of power over his fellow human beings, we do not know yet. So maybe we'll learn about this later in the novel, but not at this point. And the narrative means that Thomas Mann uses to emphasize Krokowski's dubiousness, shadiness, and unseriousness, I think that can be seen very clearly, because what he's doing here is he endows Dr. Krokowski with almost ridiculously exaggerated religious attributes. Krokowski speaks very anxiously. He stands there in a monkish dress with his arms outstretched, almost like the Lord Jesus on the cross, and saying, in other words, what Jesus said. It's quoted here in the text: "Come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden." That's a direct quotation from one of Jesus' speeches. And what is said in indirect speech also about Krokowski's language also makes it clear that he is ironically brought very close to the preaching Jesus, simply through the verbs used here. And by the way, I'm afraid I don't know whether this passage works in English as it does in the German original, because in the German original, all the verbs used are not the verbs from everyday language, but they are clearly verbs typical for the sermons directly taken out of the New Testament. So when it said he advocated the bringing of light into the unconscious mind, he explained how the abnormality was metamorphosed, he urged them to have confidence, he promised relief. So in the German original, all the verbs here are not the everyday versions of the verbs, but the verbs that we know from Martin Luther's translation of the Bible. So it's really clear this religious connotation, really making him close to the preaching Jesus. And when Krokowski leaves the room, the listeners follow him, I quote, converging upon him from all sides, without volition, hesitatingly, yet with one accord, like the throng after the Pied Piper. Or, I would add, like the disciples and the crowd behind Jesus at the Sea of Galilee. So much more could be said about the subliminal messages in the dialogue between Hans and Fräulein Engelhardt, about the discussion on the role of Dr. Behrens and the paradox of the sick doctor, or as the text says in a sort of religious exaggeration, this question, can the sick be the guide and savior of the suffering? Or we could also talk a lot more about the spatial arrangement of the medical examination rooms and Dr. Krokowski's analytical cabinet in a kind of mezzanine, an intermediate level between the upper world and the underworld, and so on and so forth. But then this video would be really far too long. And after all, I'm not intending to provide an exhaustive analysis, but just to give a few suggestions and prompts for discussion, or maybe for a second close reading with some additional information in the back of your mind. Okay, I will stop here for today. Thank you so much for your patience and listening and watching. And next weekend, around the 22nd of September, the next video will be released, and it will only be about one section, the one immediately following, with the somewhat awkwardly long title, Mounting Misgivings and of the Two Grandfathers and the Boat Ride in the Twilight. And until then, I'm looking forward to your comments or questions or any suggestions. Maybe you would like to suggest participating in the creation of a future video by being my guest and do a dialogue video. I would very much love to do that sort of collaboration, as I did in the German part of this channel already. And in the meantime, have a lot of fun reading. You may stop by my main channel, Polyglot Reading. There will be a new video upload also in the main channel this week. And what else can I say? See you next time. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.